I am 91 years old now. My name is Harold Bennett, and for the last 19 years I have lived in a small nursing facility on the edge of a quiet town. When people see someone my age sitting in a wheelchair by the window, they usually assume the story is simple, that life slowly faded and time just carried him here. But that isn't what happened to me. I had a wife once, I had a home. I had a life that took 4 decades to build, piece by careful piece. And all of it disappeared in a single afternoon when the woman who lived next door sat across from me at my kitchen table and told me a truth she had been hiding for more than 20 years. What I'm about to tell you isn't just about betrayal, it's about trust, blindness, and what happens when the two people you believe in the most slowly turn into the same enemy without you realizing it. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that the idea of them lying to you felt impossible? The kind of trust where you would defend them without hesitation, even if the whole world questioned them. If you've ever experienced that kind of trust, write the word trust in the comments. I read every message, and I'd like to know if anyone out there understands what that feels like. I met my wife Margaret in 1954. I was 29 years old at the time, working long shifts at a machine manufacturing plant in New Haven. Margaret was 25, full of laughter and warmth. The first time I saw her was at a church gathering on a Sunday evening. She was standing near the back of the hall wearing a pale blue dress, laughing at something her friend had whispered. And I remember thinking in that exact moment that I had never heard a sound so beautiful in my life. It's funny the things you remember after 70 years. I don't remember what music was playing that night. I don't remember what food they served. But I remember the sound of her laugh like it happened yesterday. We started seeing each other after that. At first, it was simple things. Walks through town after dinner. Sunday picnics. Sitting on the steps outside her parents' house talking about the future as if it were something we could design ourselves. A year later, we were married in a small ceremony with family and friends. We didn't have much money. Our first apartment had 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and windows that rattled whenever a truck drove by. But none of that mattered because we had each other. Those early years were the kind people like to remember when they grow old. Struggling together, dreaming together. I worked hard, sometimes 60 hours a week, because I wanted to build something stable for us. I wasn't chasing riches. I just wanted a good life for my family. By 1960, we managed to buy a small house on Birch Lane. It had 3 bedrooms, a narrow hallway, and a big maple tree growing in the backyard. The house cost $13,000. When I signed the papers, I remember looking at Margaret and thinking, this is where our entire life will happen. Maybe some of you watching have bought a house with someone you loved. That feeling when you step through the door and imagine birthdays, holidays, children growing up in those rooms. If you've ever had that moment, tell me in the comments what your first home felt like. Because for me, that little house on Birch Lane wasn't just a building, it was our future. 2 years after we moved in, our first child was born, a boy named Michael. 3 years later, our daughter Emily came along. Those years were busy and exhausting, but they were also the happiest years of my life. I coached Michael's little league team on weekends. I walked Emily to school almost every morning when she was young. I wasn't a perfect father. I lost my temper sometimes. I worked too many hours, but I was always there. Then in 1965, a new couple moved into the house next door. Their names were Robert and Linda Caldwell. Robert was about my age, maybe a year older. He worked selling insurance and had an easygoing personality that made people trust him instantly. Linda was a nurse at the local hospital. At first they were just neighbors, but little by little they became something more. Robert and I started talking over the fence in the evenings after work. Then those conversations turned into beers on the porch during summer nights. We talked about baseball, politics, work, and the everyday frustrations of raising children. Margaret and Linda became close too. They started meeting for coffee in the mornings. They'd go shopping together on Saturdays, sometimes disappearing for hours while Robert and I watched football games. Before long, the four of us were spending nearly every weekend together. Friday night dinners, backyard barbecues, holiday celebrations where our families sat around the same table laughing. Looking back now, it almost feels like a photograph frozen in time. Four adults who believed they had built a small, perfect community around themselves, and I truly believed Robert Caldwell was my best friend. Margaret would sometimes tease me about how much time I spent talking with him. She'd laugh and say, "If Robert lived any closer, you'd probably move into his house." I used to laugh too. Now when I think about those moments, the laughter feels different, but at the time, everything felt normal. For nearly 20 years, the four of us lived like that. Vacations together, fishing trips, birthday parties for the kids. If someone had asked me back then who I trusted most in the world, I would have said two names without hesitation: my wife Margaret and my neighbor Robert. And that's why what happened later shattered something inside me that never fully healed. Before I continue, I want to ask you another question. When you look back at your life, are there moments where you realize later that you missed signs? Small details that only make sense years afterward? If you've ever had that feeling, write "I missed the signs" in the comments. Because the truth is, the signs were there all along. I just didn't see them. In 1976, Margaret joined what she called a Wednesday evening reading club. Every week she would leave around 7 and return around 10. She always seemed happier when she came back from those nights. I thought it was a good thing. I remember telling her once, "You deserve time for yourself after everything you do for this family." She smiled and kissed my cheek. That reading club continued every Wednesday for almost 20 years. Around 1978, Margaret started wearing a different perfume. I noticed it one evening when she walked past me in the kitchen. It was stronger than the one she used before. I told her it smelled nice. She said Linda had recommended it. I didn't think about it again. In 1981, Robert built a tall wooden fence between our two backyards. That surprised me because we had never needed one before. Our families moved freely between the houses for years. When I asked him about it, he laughed and said Linda wanted more privacy. I helped him build that fence. I spent 2 entire weekends hammering nails and lifting wooden panels into place. It never crossed my mind that I was helping build a wall that would hide something happening on the other side. Around 1984, Margaret started sleeping in the guest bedroom some nights. She said my snoring kept her awake. Maybe it did. I didn't argue about it. Then one afternoon in 1988, I came home early from work. Margaret's car was in the driveway, but she wasn't inside the house. After looking around for a few minutes, I walked next door. I found her sitting at Linda's kitchen table, drinking coffee. It was 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. Robert's car was parked in the driveway too. Linda told me he had taken the day off because he wasn't feeling well. I said okay and walked back home. At the time, none of it seemed unusual. Because when you trust someone, you don't look for reasons to doubt them. You just believe, and that belief can blind you to things that would be obvious to anyone else. By 1993, I had just turned 72 and retired from the factory after nearly 40 years of work. I received a gold watch, a small pension, and the quiet satisfaction of believing I had done my part as a husband and father. I thought the rest of my life would be peaceful. But one Thursday afternoon, while Margaret was out running errands and Robert was supposedly at work, Linda Caldwell knocked on my door. When I opened it, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Her face looked pale and exhausted. Her eyes carried a kind of anger I had never seen before. She walked into my kitchen and sat down slowly at the table. I remember the clock ticking on the wall behind her. I remember the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I remember every tiny detail of that room, because it was the last time I sat there as the man I thought I was. Linda folded her hands together and looked at me. Then she said words that shattered the life I believed in. "Harold, there's something you need to know. Margaret and Robert have been seeing each other behind our backs for more than 20 years. For several seconds I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there staring at her while my mind tried to understand what she had said. 20 years, 2 decades of lies hidden inside a life I believed was honest, and that was only the beginning of the truth she was about to reveal. For a long moment after Linda said those words, I just sat there staring at the table between us. My hands were resting on the wood. They were completely still. Your mind does strange things when it hears something like that. It starts slowly flipping through memories like pages in a book. Every moment suddenly looks different. Linda told me she had discovered letters hidden in Robert's desk drawer. Not 1 or 2 letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, notes written back and forth. They had been careful, using excuses that had become routine: the Wednesday night reading club, the afternoons Margaret spent shopping with Linda. If you've ever had a moment where a simple routine turned out to mean something completely different, write "I know that feeling" in the comments. All those little details that once felt harmless suddenly lined up like pieces of a puzzle. The reading club, the perfume, the fence, the guest bedroom. And the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing how easily I had trusted them. I remember asking Linda one question: how long? 19, maybe 20 years. That meant it started sometime around 1974. I did the math in my head. Half of my marriage had been a lie. Half of my life with Margaret had been shared with another man without me knowing. Linda told me she had confronted Robert the night before. He didn't deny it. That's something people rarely talk about when betrayal happens. The shame of being fooled. You start asking yourself if other people knew, if they whispered. I don't remember how long I stayed there. At some point the clock on the wall struck 5 and the sound snapped me back into reality. Margaret would be coming home. That evening when she walked through the front door carrying grocery bags, everything looked exactly the same. The same kitchen, the same woman I had loved. I said, "Linda came by today." Her smile faded almost instantly. That was the moment I knew. I hadn't even asked the question yet, but her face had answered it. "Is it true?" I asked quietly. For a few seconds, Margaret didn't say anything. She simply leaned against the counter and looked at the floor. Then she sighed. Finally, she looked up and said something I will never forget. "Yes, it's true. No denial, no shock, just the truth." I asked her why. Margaret didn't hesitate. She said, "You're a good man, Harold, but you're predictable, safe. Robert makes me feel alive." Alive. That word echoed in my mind like a hammer hitting metal. 40 years of loyalty, reduced to the idea that I was simply too ordinary. She told me she cared about both of us, that she never planned to hurt me, that things had simply happened until they became part of her life. I remember shaking my head slowly and saying something that still feels true today. You can't betray someone for 20 years and call it love. Whatever she felt for Robert, and whatever she claimed to feel for me, it wasn't love. Love doesn't hide in shadows for 2 decades. Love doesn't watch someone sit at the same dinner table while pretending nothing is wrong. But what came after was worse than the affair itself. Because the betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial, planned. and carefully executed over many years. The next week I spoke to a lawyer in town, a quiet man in his 60s who handled small divorce cases. As he started reviewing our financial records, something disturbing began to appear. Margaret had been quietly moving money from our savings. Not large amounts, just small transfers every few months, enough that I never noticed. It built a separate account I didn't know existed. Several credit cards had been opened in my name. Even a second mortgage had been taken out against the house, a mortgage I never agreed to. By the time the lawyer finished untangling everything, the truth was devastating. The house I paid for was buried under debt, our savings nearly gone. The only thing Margaret couldn't touch was my pension. That small monthly payment from the factory was the only thing left of my life. My lawyer told me I could fight it. He said we could sue for fraud, press charges, drag the entire situation into court. But I was 72 years old and I was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. The entire neighborhood already knew. Whispers had started. People avoided eye contact at the grocery store. Some looked at me with sympathy. Others looked at me like I was the fool who had been tricked for half his life. Maybe they were right. Sometimes the hardest thing about betrayal isn't losing the person you loved. It's losing the version of yourself you believed you were. The man who thought he understood his own life. In March of 1994, the divorce became official. Margaret kept the house and our savings. She kept the car. Everything. All I left with was a suitcase and my pension, standing on the sidewalk in front of that house as I moved out. 40 years of memories lived inside those walls. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, children running through the hallways, and now it belonged to someone else. Robert was standing in his yard watching as I loaded my car. He raised his hand and waved. That moment told me something about human nature. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most don't see themselves as villains. Sometimes they believe they simply took what they wanted, and that belief allows them to sleep peacefully at night. Before I continue, I want to ask you something personal. If you discovered someone you trusted had betrayed you for decades, would you fight them in court, or would you walk away quietly? There isn't a right answer, but I'm curious what you would do. Tell me honestly in the comments, because the decision I made next would change the rest of my life forever. In the end, I chose not to fight. Some people might say that was a mistake. Maybe they're right. Maybe if I had pushed harder, things would have turned out differently. But when you reach your 70s, something changes inside you. The energy you once had for battles begins to fade. You start measuring your time differently. Every year feels more precious than the last, and the idea of spending those years in courtrooms and legal arguments feels like wasting the little life you have left. So I walked away, leaving behind the house, the memories, and the life I once knew. The divorce papers were signed in early spring of 1995. I packed my clothes into one worn suitcase and placed a few old photographs inside the front pocket. Pictures of my children when they were young. A photo of Margaret and me standing in front of the house on Birch Lane the day we bought it. I almost left that photo behind, but something in me couldn't do it. Not because I wanted to remember the betrayal, but because I wanted to remember that once, long ago, there had been something real. I stood on the sidewalk that afternoon staring at the house for a long time. The maple tree in the yard was taller than I remembered. Its branches stretched over the roof like arms protecting the place. I had planted that tree myself 35 years earlier, and now it was shading a house that no longer belonged to me. Margaret closed the front door behind her without saying goodbye. Robert walked over from his yard and stood near the fence we had built together years earlier. He didn't apologize. He didn't say anything at all. He simply looked at me, nodded once, and went back into his house. That was the last time I ever stood on Birch Lane. After that, life became smaller. At first, I tried to stay with my son Michael in California. He welcomed me into his apartment with open arms. But his wife, Laura, wasn't as comfortable with the arrangement. Their place was small, and they already had their own struggles. I could see the tension building each week I stayed there. She began leaving brochures for retirement communities on the kitchen counter. She stopped setting a place for me at the dinner table unless Michael reminded her. Michael was caught between his father and his wife, and the last thing I wanted was to damage his marriage the way mine had been destroyed. So after 4 months, I told him I had found another place to live. That wasn't exactly true, but sometimes fathers lie to protect their children. I moved out quietly one morning while he was at work. I left a short note thanking him for letting me stay. If you're a parent listening to this, you'll understand something important. Watching your child struggle because of your problems hurts more than the problems themselves. My daughter Emily lived in Florida at the time. She wanted to help, but she was raising 2 children alone while working as a school teacher. She barely had enough space for herself, let alone an aging father who needed constant support. When I told her everything that had happened, she cried on the phone. She kept saying, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I wish I could do more." But I told her the truth she needed to hear. You've already done enough by caring. By that point, another problem had begun, quietly growing in my body. My hands had started shaking months earlier. At first, it was small things, dropping a glass, struggling to button a shirt, losing balance occasionally when I stood up too quickly. A doctor eventually gave the diagnosis, early-stage Parkinson's disease. It wasn't severe yet, but it was enough that living alone would become dangerous over time. At 72 years old, my body was beginning to betray me just like the people I had trusted. The doctor recommended a care facility where nurses could monitor my condition. That's how I eventually found a place called Silver Meadows, a small nursing home about 40 minutes outside the city. It wasn't luxurious, just a quiet building surrounded by trees. My room was simple, a single bed, a narrow window overlooking the back garden, a dresser with 3 drawers. Everything I owned in the world fit inside those drawers. When I first moved in, the silence felt overwhelming. Nights were the hardest. You spend decades sleeping beside someone, hearing their breathing in the darkness, feeling their presence in the room. Then suddenly you're alone. But time has a strange way of softening even the sharpest wounds. The years passed slowly. Michael visited whenever he could. At first it was once a month, then every few months, eventually once a year when work allowed it. In 2012, he died suddenly from a heart attack. He was only 58 years old. There's something unnatural about burying your own child. That's the quiet agreement life makes with us. When that order breaks, something inside you breaks too. Emily still calls sometimes, especially on holidays. She's older now, dealing with her own health problems. I never blame her for not visiting often. Life moves forward for the living. Meanwhile, Margaret continued living in the house on Birch Lane, the house I bought, the house I repaired every summer, the house where my children grew up. Robert moved in with her a few months after the divorce. They lived there together for 13 years. Margaret passed away in 2007. Robert died a few years later, alone in a hospital room after Linda had already left him long before that. And somehow, I'm still here, 91 years old, sitting in a quiet room with a small window and a view of the garden. The strange thing about life is that sometimes the people who cause the deepest damage disappear long before you do. You outlive them. You outlive the anger. You outlive the pain. And eventually you're left with nothing but the lessons. If there is one thing I have learned from all these years, it's this. Trust is one of the most powerful things we give another human being. but trust without awareness can become blindness. Loving someone doesn't mean ignoring the signs, and sometimes the most important relationship you will ever protect is the one you have with your own dignity. Before I finish, I want to ask you something. Do you believe a person can truly rebuild their life after betrayal like that? Or do some wounds simply stay with us forever? Tell me honestly in the comments. I read them when the nights feel long, and hearing other people's thoughts reminds me that even though I sit alone in this room, I'm not completely alone in the world. Thank you for listening to my story.